right, hello everyone, and welcome to this video about water procurement in an urban setting or a wilderness setting as well. I know this is a primitive skills course, but in an SHTF event, we might be in an urban setting and we might be in a wilderness setting, and knowing all of these different things are going to be important. So we're going to go over both urban and wilderness environments. Now, we all know the rule of threes, so I'm going to spare you that speech for now. But I will say that we might find ourselves working harder in a grid down event or a post collapse situation because we won't have access to all the conveniences we have today. So we might be drinking a little more water than we think we will, or if we can find it. Hopefully, we all have some amount of water stored and we're prepared for this situation. But the amount of space that water takes up makes it really difficult to hide. And the amount of water that we use means that at some point or another, this water is going to be gone. Now, if all the water we have stored is gone because we used it or someone has come and taken it from us, what would we do at that point? Finding water in an urban area it'll be difficult. But if we can stay away from these quote unquote zombie zones and think about places other people might not think about, we might be able to find water safely. Now, before we get into this, I have a little disclaimer here. Because our water is treated, we haven't built up the immunity to these microorganisms like our ancestors did or people of the past. This can be done, but usually it takes some getting used to. You might get a little sick once or twice. So use your own judgment on water sources, but just know that Giardia and Cryptosporidium can cause serious illness depending on how much is ingested. Now, like I said, we can build up an immunity to certain levels of these bacteria, but it's always better to be safe than sorry. This is just a recommendation of these techniques, and it's just meant to give you some ideas. So use these at your own risk. Now let's go into well water real quick. And we where I live, we have a well, but what do we do if the grid goes down because it's an electric well? And my solution to this is installing a manual well pump. And we haven't gotten around to this yet, but it's on the top of my list because this is a great source of water, a continual source of water. As long as you can maintain your area, as long as you can stay where you are, you've got a continual fresh water source. Our well is between 50 and 100 feet deep. 50 and 100 feet deep. So what my thought is they make this earth straw well pump, which is the picture on the right here, and it's going to cost about $600 to install this. But when you think about the advantages of having all the water you need and not having to worry about going out and fighting the crazies and all of that stuff, $600 is basically a drop in the bucket. I'll leave a link to a video Todd from Prepper website did about his installation. He installed one of these and shows you exactly how easy it is and how anybody can really do it. But not all of us have access to a well. So let's think about some ideas where we could find water in an urban area as well as a wilderness area and still maintain our safety. And like I said, staying away from these zombies and trained monkeys that are all headed to the grocery stores and the FEMA camps and all of that stuff. So basically what we want to do when we're in an urban area is zig when everybody zags. And this kind of goes into every area of prepping. We don't want to be the ones following the herds and all of that stuff. Sometimes finding water is going to require us to travel outside to find water. Sometimes it can be found right in our backyard. But the key to this is to go places that other people wouldn't think about. And giving you a better chance of maybe getting in and getting out safely. Most people won't even take the time to learn about this, let alone think about it when they're dying of thirst or they're hungry. So let's go into some of these places that might give you some ideas about where you could look for water. First, we've got heaters, sprinklers, and pipes. Water heaters store between 30 and 80 gallons of water, depending on the size of the home. Some businesses will even have bigger commercial water heaters for you to tap into. Another bonus is that the water has already been treated, so it's probably already safe to drink, depending on, if it's a really old water heater, it might have some junk in there and stuff. But there will also be water in the pipes that run through the walls for businesses, for homes. Maybe there's some abandoned businesses around, stuff like that. You might have to do a little demolition to get this done, but desperate times call for desperate measures. Now, if you have some warning, you could also fill your bathtub. I don't have the bathtub in here, but you could also fill your bathtub, and that gives you an extra 40 gallons or so. If you have two bathtubs, maybe that's 80 gallons or so. And like I said, unfortunately, this is something that most people won't think about, and something that can be done in just minutes if we have a little bit of warning. Now, if the water in your home runs out, think about places that might be abandoned. Like I said, like businesses and even homes in your area. You don't want to go into somebody's house and drain their water heater or something. But think about this stuff. And then garden hoses and sprinklers. The residual water you can find in a garden hose isn't going to be 50 to 100 gallons, but it might be enough to get you through the day. Sprinkler systems can be found in parks and personal residences. Although, like I said, tearing up your neighbor's front yard might lead to a few more issues other than just being thirsty or getting water. Other places you can find this are, golf courses, parks, and businesses. Think of some areas around you that have ponds or fountains. Golf courses and parks are places that might have streams running through them or little ponds and stuff like that. But you need to make sure and be careful with these, because parks and golf courses, stuff like that, are usually manicured to look really pretty and have flowers and all that, meaning that there could be pesticides or chemicals in the water. And filtering water doesn't take out the chemicals that are in the water. Using something like a solar still or finding another way to distill this water might be necessary, or boiling this water, stuff like that. But again, in a worst case scenario, being sick and alive is better than being dead. Local businesses in a SHTF scenario or post collapse, these offices could become abandoned, and people will most likely overlook these places because they don't see them as necessary, and we see them as a resource. Office buildings are going to have stuff like refrigerators, storage closets, vending machines, coffee pots, stuff like that we can take advantage of all these things. You might not only find some soda and some water and some other stuff, you might find a few snacks to munch on and maybe even some coffee to take home with you. Seriously though, businesses could turn out to be a good place for supplies other than just water. Look around your office or places you work and see what things that you might be able to use, the employee areas, stuff like that. Now, also we have, you can, toilets, pools, and streams is what I've got here, and none of us want to drink from a toilet, and this pool doesn't look very appealing at all. But these are things that we need to kind of think about, and when push comes to shove, we're gonna have to do some things, but we need to be able to do it. We need to have the knowledge to do this stuff safely. Older toilets hold up to 5 to 6 gallons of water, and the new toilets only hold about 1.6 because the EPA requirements for water conservation. But if you can find one of these older toilets, or you have one of these older toilets, that could be 5 days worth of water for one person. Now, keep in mind, I'm talking about the tank here, not the bowl. Either way, though, even if you had to drink out of the bowl, I would still boil the water. Because anytime a plunger is used on a toilet, it kind of pushes that feces, that contaminated water, backwards into the tank. And even though the CDC states that water in the tank is safe to drink, I'm not going to take any chances. So, and also when push comes to shove, I would boil and drink the water from a toilet bowl if I have to. It might sound gross, but like I said, I would rather be alive than maybe sick and alive, but at least I'm alive and not dead. Sometimes you have to do what you have to do. Many people, swimming pools, a lot of people have, depending on your area, a lot of people have swimming pools. These could be small above ground pools, or even the larger pools that are dug into the ground. We don't have many here, but in places like California and Florida and all that, I'm sure they're everywhere. Arizona, in an SHTF scenario, you might want to be looking for these pools that have been left untreated for a while, that kind of look like this one, because the sunlight burns out the pool chemicals in a hurry, and then it leaves it just water. It's nasty looking water, but it's just water. But like I said, you'd still want to filter and boil this anyway. Now, personally, I would drink water from a toilet bowl before I would drink water from a public pool because they're kind of the same thing. But and of course always boiled and filtered, of course. And then rivers and streams. When you're thinking about rivers and streams that run through a city, you need to think about where that water came from. There might not be anything around that around you that could contaminate that water, but just a few miles upstream there could be factories or other things that could be contaminating that water, and then it's running downstream to you. Again, filtering is not going to remove the chemicals, so you'll need to figure out a way to distill this water or boil this water, and it's going to take longer, but you still need to protect yourself, even if that means from yourself. Another way to do this is anywhere that collects water. You've got rooftops, you've got gutters and all of that stuff. And depending on how much it rains or snows in your area, finding places where water collects could become a good alternative water source for you. Any place that collects water without being disturbed could be a good water source in the city or urban area. Places like flat rooftops where water might pool after it rains or snows could be a good water source that people wouldn't even think about. And all of these buildings have a way for this, and houses have a way for this water to run off and enter the sewers. If we can find the path that this water travels and collect it, or maybe trap it before it makes it down into those sewers, we could have a water source that's kind of stored. If we can store it in these gutters that nobody else even really knows about, if we can find one in an alley tucked away somewhere. So just a good thing to think about with gutters and rooftops and stuff like that. Now, I haven't cleaned my gutters in 2 years, so in a pinch, I'm sure I could, collect some rainwater out of it. We're not legally allowed to collect rainwater here in Colorado, but I guarantee you in an SHTF event, I would without a doubt be collecting rainwater. And I've even got a few buckets ready and set up for when that happens. Now, also, let's see. Also, we've got pet stores, the zoo, and theme parks. Places like the zoo, pet stores, and theme parks, or any place that needs to have a lot of water available, could be a good place to look for water. Now, I'm not saying jump into the bear cage and get your water from their pond or the hippopotamuses or anything like that, but that water has to come from somewhere. It has to get into those pools somewhere. So if we can find that source, that might be an option for collecting a little bit of water as well. Theme parks and water parks might be a good option as well, because people aren't going to be thinking about these places when they're in an SHTF situation. They're going to be thinking about, what can I get from Walmart? How am I going to survive? How am I going to do this stuff? They're not going to be thinking about, going down a water slide or riding a roller coaster or anything like that. So these might be good places to find as well. Again, some of these, it might be stagnant water that's laying around, so we're going to have to figure out a way to make sure this stuff is clean. Now, I'm not so sure that I would be going to a mall during an SHTF event, but there are stores all over the city that, like industrial areas or little places that are separated from these big structures. When all of these places get looted, the shelves will probably be empty in them, but looking in places like storage rooms or employee areas, they could lead to, different stuff, not only water, but other supplies that you might need. So these are places that people might not think about, and these could be a great source of water. So kind of think of like 5 areas around your house, that where you could, in a pinch, you could find some water. And I do this all the time when I'm driving around. I look at, river sources with, different places that I could think of that might have water, that are kind of in my area if I had to bug out or take off real quick. So just kind of think about a few different places in your area where if you had to, you could find that water. So let's go into getting water in the wild, or finding water in the wild. To increase our chances of finding water, there's a bunch of different ways we can look. And I've got this picture on the right here because it really shows, it really depicts a few different ways that you can look and you can find water. Water, travels downhill. It finds the path of least resistance. So if you can find valleys or low areas where water naturally drains, like rock crevices and cliffs and all of that stuff, Even in the rocks itself, like this picture right here, there might be places after it rains where the water kind of pools and you can find the water right there. That might be a good idea. You know, in areas where it's muddy or damp, you might be able to dig a hole. Even if you can't see the water there, you might be able to dig a hole down a little bit and get that water to kind of fill into that hole and get a little bit of water that way. You know, you could collect the dew off of leaves, like I mentioned in the filtering video. I'm not sure if you've watched that yet, but in that video I talk about how you can wrap a plastic bag or something around the leaves, and in the early morning that dew that collects will kind of condense in there, and that heat from the sun will condense that water basically, and then you have water to drink from right there. And also in this picture right here, and this is another thing you can do as you're traveling around, you can see that the vegetation is different near this stream. There are different kind of trees, different kind of plant life, and you can see this as you're traveling down the road, even on on the side of the highway near overpasses, where you can tell where water collects, because this different type of plant life is going to grow there. Patches of green vegetation indicate water of some sort. Some of the trees that like plenty of water are like cottonwoods, willows, sycamores, river birch, river maple, some ash trees, stuff like that. If you see these trees that aren't just like the pine trees, you'll know that there's kind of water in the area. And like I said, you might not see the water, but that doesn't mean the water might not be underground. And if you just dig a hole, you could find that. Other places to find water are places where animal tracks converge. You know, that's a good sign that there might be water around. Different kinds of animal tracks. If they're traveling a path to get to a water source, that might be a good way of finding water. Animals, for the most part, need to be close to water because they need to drink water every day. Insects are a good way to find water too. There could be ants that are in a line crawling up a tree, meaning that there's a little pool of water in that tree, and if you can get into that, you could find the water in there. And like I said, insects have to stay close to water. Let's take bees for an example. On average, they tend to fly a maximum distance of about 4 miles from their hive, and therefore the water source has to be found in that radius. So you know that if there are bees around, there's probably some sort of water around. Now, that doesn't mean there's a huge river or anything like that, because bees are pretty small. They don't need the amount of water we do, but it tells you that there is water nearby. Now, birds can be a good way of figuring out where water is as well, because birds, especially in the early mornings, they're going to fly a straight line to these water holes, meaning they're not going to go from tree to tree. Once they've already drank and they've had their fill, and then they're in hunting mode, so to speak, they're going to fly from tree to tree, kind of going away from the water. So in the early mornings, when you can see which way the birds are traveling, you might be able to tell which, where a water source is. So you have a better idea anyway. Nothing is going to guarantee it, but it might give you a better idea. And remember that these birds and stuff, they eat nuts and stuff like that. Whereas mammals, they get their basic water needs because they're eating other animals. Grazing animals tend to stay fairly close to water because they need to drink at least in the mornings and in the evenings. So, finding these game trails might be a good way to find this water source. But remember, the carnivorous animals, the meat-eating animals, they get their moisture from their prey, or not all of it, but a lot of moisture from their prey. Therefore, they're not so depending on this water source. So these are just a few ways of kind of thinking about how to find water in a wilderness situation, in an urban situation. There's also different plants that will collect water. You can get them from the roots and all of that stuff. But just think about the different ways that it might not be staring us right in front of the face. It might not be a lake or a river, but there is water out there. And if we use Mother Nature, and if we understand Mother Nature, and we know how these animals operate and what their instincts are the same as ours are going to be. Their instincts are survival, and they need to stay away from the predators, and they need to have food and water. So if we can see how these guys act, they can help us and lead us to water sources and food sources and all of that other stuff. And in one of the later modules, we'll get into tracking and all of that stuff, and that'll make a lot more sense about, you know, kind of getting into the brains of these animals, so to speak, and knowing how they go along their daily lives. So I appreciate everybody watching this video, and we will see you in the next one.